Go ahead and just start it.
I always see your kids work.
You know, it's interesting. Probably a few I grew up in church. I attended regularly 9 months before I was born. You know, very, very regular. And very active, went through church, you know, back in the day when we had all this stuff, right? RAs and GAs and brotherhood and training union and all of that. And then after through college, I took called to ministry. So after my college degree, after I finished college, I went to seminary. And I'm learning all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, I was really ticked off. How come I had to go to seminary to learn this basic stuff? I really should have learned this in church. I mean, I should have, because I was there all the time. So when I got done with seminary, every church I pastored since seminary, we have taught all this stuff that you will learn in seminary in church. Like, it's just ridiculous that we didn't, you know, anyway. So, we're going to take a few weeks and do a little background between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then we're going to do 1 week and we'll look at basically first century Roman world and politics and all of that. You're going to know a lot of the names, and you don't realize how connected they are with Scripture. You know, you kind of think it's church history over here and world history over here, but obviously they're all exactly the same time. If you look at your little notes there, just a brief history of the nation of Israel, up to speed. We know we had the United Kingdom, remember, which was Saul, David, and Solomon, right? And that's as long as it lasted. Just some notes over there if you want to grab them. And that's it, right? And that lasted from 1020 to 922. And then the divided kingdom. Northern kingdom, southern kingdom, right? Northern in Israel, southern of Judah. And that went for about what? 200 years. And then the Assyrians came in. We're talking about that now on Sunday morning. And they ruled from 722 to 606, and they destroyed the northern kingdom in 722. And then the Babylonians came in. And then in 587, they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and took most everybody off to captivity in Babylon. And then when the Persians came to power, the Medes and the Persians, right, remember Xerxes and all that, they come back and they rebuild the temple. Takes about 5 years. Remember the book of Nehemiah? It should have taken 5 years, right? And then that's where the Old Testament ends. It's right there. But then there's a Greek period, and a Hasmonean period, and a Roman period. And tonight we're going to start talking about the Greek and the Hasmonean period. And that's between the Old Testament and New Testament. And it really changes how you see the first century and how the New Testament was written. Let's begin with someone you've heard of. Alexander the Great. Right? Mm-hmm. His dad was Philip. Okay? Philip was the Macedon, was a great military leader, built a really huge empire. He basically took all the Greek city-states and he started coalescing together to make the Greek Empire. He was on the verge of really pulling it all together, and he died. Then his young son takes over, Alexander, in 337. Now, I don't know if you realize this, that Alexander was tutored by Aristotle. Aristotle was the tutor of Alexander. So, Alexander had two passions, well, he had three, now the third would kill him. That was revelry and immorality and all of that. But the first one was Hellenism. And I'm going to use that word a lot tonight. Hellenism means the spreading of Greek culture and religion. So to Aristotle, he believed that Greek, for the world to be united, they had to be united under one culture, one language, one religion, Greek. And that process of pushing Greek culture was called Hellenization. Okay? And so Alexander, when they conquered people, he just didn't conquer them. He conquered them, and they began to say, you need to be absorbed into the Greek culture. And then also his second was just hugely spreading. At his death, and he conquered Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and all the way into India. And was on the verge of capturing even more. Again, he pushed the Greek language. It was called Koine Greek, or Ancient Greek. That's what the New Testament was written in. This version of Greek is a dead language, like Latin. It's not the same Greek as today that the New Testament was written in. He eventually became really a tyrant. Very, very arbitrary in his leadership and his military campaigns. But revelry, immorality, alcohol, drinking, women. He died of a fever at 33. All his life. We don't think of Alexander the Great, but he was 33 years old when he died. And there was no succession plan. No heir, no succession plan. So his 4 top generals start fighting for the next 40 years. Because all 4 of them were committed to one world rule, right? And to Hellenization. All of them. So they start fighting among themselves. They come down to main 3 eventually. One would be the Macedonians, which don't really affect much of what we're going to talk about here. And then the Ptolemies, with a P. The Ptolemies are Egypt. All of Egypt is ruled by the Ptolemies because the first general was Ptolemy I. He was one of Alexander's generals. He created an empire in Egypt called the Ptolemaic Empire. And then Seleucid, the other general, started the Seleucid Empire. So we had the Seleucid Empire in Syria and Damascus. They came in after Alexander. And what's in between Syria and Egypt? It's Palestine. So, even though they have 2 strong nations, they still want to become one. So where do the battles take place? Right? They're both highly committed to Hellenization, but not as much with Ptolemies. And by the way, the last Ptolemaic ruler, the last Ptolemaic princess that died, that ended the line of the Ptolemies, was Cleopatra. Okay, she was the last Ptolemaic royalty from Ptolemy I. She was the last one. And we'll talk about her a little bit, because she and Herod the Great, they hated each other bad. For good reason, on her part. By the way. So anyway, all these are pushing. Now, after this 40-year battle, Palestine becomes under the control of Egypt, of the Ptolemies. So, initially, in this intertestamental period, Palestine is controlled by the Ptolemaic rulers in northern Egypt. Okay? Now, these are Greek rulers. The Greek capital city was Alexandria, right? When he comes to power, he basically deposes the governor of Palestine, puts in his own governor, and tells them, you're now our territory. But they didn't mind the Jews. As a matter of fact, he encouraged a lot of Jews to move to Alexandria. And during that time, a lot of the Jewish population in Alexandria became Hellenistic Jews. Remember in Acts, what was the reason for the deacons? Remember? The Hellenistic Jews said, you're not treating our widows as well as the more strict Judea Jews. Okay? Like, you're treating the local widows a lot better than you are the Hellenistic widows, and we need to be fair. So the Hellenistic Jews were more open to Greek culture, open to a little more things. And the ones Jerusalem like, now you're a bunch of liberals, and you're going too far. You're diluting Judaism. So anyway, so they treated Jews fairly well. So during this period of time, Jews were treated fairly well. As a matter of fact, during this period, they lived in Alexandria. Now, Alexandria at that time had the largest library in the world. The Alexandria, matter of fact, their goal was to get a physical copy of every book and written work in the world. So whenever a ship would port in Alexandria, you had to offload any books, documents you had, take them to the library, they would copy them, and then give them back to you. And it was a massive correlation. When the barbarians conquered Alexandria, what did they do? They burned the library to the ground. However, in the we do this later. The late 1800s up to the early 1900s, the best and oldest copies of the New Testament have ever been found were in this region. You know, it's also very dry. So, during this time, the Jews in Alexandria wrote their own version of the Old Testament. It's a Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's called the Septuagint. Okay? You'll see it sometimes in like Sunday school literature. It's represented by this, which is the Greek, the Latin, Roman numerals of what? 70. 70. The reason is, tradition said that 72 Jewish elders basically locked themselves away and they translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And 72 was too long, so they shortened it and rounded it down to 70. So whenever you see anyone talk about the Septuagint, they just say this. Most of the writers of the New Testament, when they quoted the Old Testament, they quoted often they quoted the Septuagint. It was kind of like the modern version of the Old Testament in the first century, because Alexander was very successful. Everybody in the first century, the common language was what? Greek. Even though Roman with Latin ruled, the Greeks' culture overran Roman culture. The Romans even just adopted the Greek gods and changed their names. So Greek culture continued really far. So Alexander was very successful in that part. So anyway, the Egyptians and the Syrians constantly fought with Palestine caught right there in the middle. And then finally, there was a battle. I won't go into all that. And the Ptolemies lost. When they lost, control of Palestine moved to the northern split of Alexander's kingdom called the Seleucids. Okay? The Seleucids now controlled Palestine. And they did not like it. Unlike the Ptolemies. They weren't very kind. The most famous and powerful of their leaders was a guy called Antiochus. Antiochus IV. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus, a manifestation of God. Very humble guy. The Jews called him Antiochus Epiphanes, which means madman or crazy one. Okay? And you'll see why. He had a very aggressive plan to expand the Seleucid Empire to become the next Greek empire. He needed money. He targeted the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Not to conquer it, because of all the taxes and tribute. All the Jews, remember, they pour so much money in the temple and worship and sacrifices. So he thought, if I can just get a good portion of all the money that's pouring into the temple, I can support my military ventures. The high priest at that time of the Zadok line, right? He was from the line of Aaron, the Zadok line. His name was Onias III. He wasn't very open to that idea. So Antigonus kicked him out and put his brother Jason in. Jason had gone behind the scenes and told Antiochus, if you kick my brother out of high priest, put me as high priest, I'll up how much I pay you. I'll up it. You'll get a lot more. And I'm sympathetic to Hellenization. I'll be glad to start pushing Hellenism through the temple. And so Antiochus came in, kicked Onias out, put Jason in, and the money went up. Okay? Jews were not happy with that, were they? You shouldn't be meddling with the high priest, the role. Well, then Antiochus decides, I'm gonna push down and attack Egypt. I need a little bit more money, so he decided that he would just kick Jason out and put his own high priest in called Melanus. Now this is significant because Jason was at least in the lineage of the Zadokite line, right, of the Old Testament line. Melanus had no high priestly blood in his line anywhere. So the Jews were like, wait a minute, you're just putting a random person as high priest. But he did because Melanus gave even more tribute to Antiochus and pushed Hellenism even further. And so that was a big split. So the Jews already ticked off, right? So their anger is rising, like you just meddled in the core of who we are, putting in Melanus. He taxed Egypt. It looked like going well, and it did not go well because of this new up-and-coming country and kingdom called Rome. And Rome comes over and helps the Ptolemies, and they humiliate Antiochus. The Romans come in, they surround him, they put him in a room, and they draw a circle in the dirt around him and say, get out the circle, and we're coming up for you. So he took his army, he went back up through Palestine, back to Syria, humiliated. And guess who the humiliation is going to be taken out on? The Jews. He decides it's time for the Judaism to end. Completely. You're going to become completely Greeks, total Hellenization, completely. And then, unfortunately, Jason, who he kicked out, decided, I think I can revolt and get the high priest job back. That didn't go over well. So Antiochus brought the Seleucid army down and just randomly killed men, women, and children just in mass. Just in mass in Jerusalem. At that. And it's probably because he's also ticked that he lost the battle. And he takes it on there. And then he built, this is significant, he built an acra or a citadel, basically a military post right next to the temple. So he kept an armed military guard right next to the temple. Like, you do this again, we're here. I don't have to send anybody down. We're just walking across the street. He kept a large military group there. Confiscated so much out of the temple, and took it back. And then went back to Antioch. He decided it's time, we're done. So circumcision, illegal. Punishable by death. Worshiping on the Sabbath, illegal. Punishable by death. Any religious festival at all, period, illegal. To own a copy or a portion of the Old Testament, illegal. And then he went and had a statue of Zeus put in the middle of the temple in Jerusalem. And then, insult to injury, he went and took a huge sow pig and sacrificed it on the altar inside the temple, outside the Holy of Holies. And he said, Judaism is done. It's over. There will no more process of becoming Greek or Hellenization. So obviously a lot of Jews had a hard time with that, didn't they? And then we get into what we call the Maccabean period of history. This is where the Apocrypha comes from. You remember the Apocrypha? The Apocrypha, some Catholic Bibles, some Lutheran Bibles have it. It's a historical writing between the Old Testament and New Testament. Jews never did and never have accepted the Scripture. Christianity never did either until the Catholic Church way, way, way late said it's Scripture. It's interesting as you read it, because if you've never read it, I challenge you to read it. You know how in the Old Testament, like you bring up someone like, let's say David. I mean, he's a kind of a hero, right, in the Old Testament. A lot of great things, but we also see the other side of him, right? We see his immorality, we see some bad decisions, we see a little bit of a emotional up and down. Well, in the Apocrypha, everybody's a perfect hero in every story. Throughout. There is not a blemish or a bad characteristics ever. It's just kind of like reading. And, when you read it, you're like, well, obviously this doesn't sound like Scripture. Now, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, The first book is First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, Third Maccabees, Fourth Maccabees. They're real interesting, but the first and second Maccabees have a lot of history in them, but they're not scripture. The level of scripture. So they're ticked off at we got to give up Judaism. They're ticked off the outlawing of Judaism, and they're really upset about the whole high priest thing. Like, it's not even the right guy, not even the right family. But they're fighting. There's collaborators, right? There's passive resistant. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to get killed. And then there's the militant. And we need to get rid of these guys. Now, Eleazar was a 90-year-old man, and basically the revolt and rebellion kind of started with him. And I was going to tell you the story, but I think I'll just read it real quick. This is out of second one. He says, now there was an elderly and highly respected teacher of the law by the name of Eleazar, whose mouth was being forced open to make him eat pork. And that was the test. They'd go to a town and they would make everybody eat pork and then sacrifice to the deities. Okay? But he preferred an honorable death rather than a life of disgrace. So he spit out the meat and went willingly to the place of torture, showing how people should have courage to refuse unclean food, even if it cost their lives. Now those in charge of the sacrifice had been friends of Eleazar for a long time, and because of this friendship, they told him privately, bring your own meat from home and just pretend to eat the pork. He's like, no. He said, here it is. But Eleazar made a decision worthy of his gray hair and of his advanced age. All his life he had lived in perfect obedience to God's holy law, so he replied, kill me here and now. Such a deception is not worthy of a man of my years. Many young people would think that I had denied my faith. And after I was 90 years old, if I pretend to eat this meat just to live a little while longer, it would bring shame and disgrace on me and lead many young people astray. For the present, I might be able to escape what you can do to me, but whether I live or die, I cannot escape the Almighty God. If I die bravely now, I show that I deserve my long life, and it will set a good example of the way the young people should be willing and glad to die for our sake and respect of law. As soon as he said these things, he went off to be tortured, and the very people who had treated him kindly a few minutes before now turned against him because they had thought he spoke like a madman. When they beaten him almost to the point of death, he groaned and said, the Lord possesses all holy knowledge. He knows I could have escaped this terrible suffering and death, yet he also knows that I gladly suffer these things because I fear him. So Eleazar died. But his courageous death was remembered as a glorious example, not only by the young people, but the entire nation. So he kind of started it. And there's another story, I'm not going to read it because it's really, really graphic. But there was a woman, and she and her 7 sons refused to eat pork when they came to her town, and they brutally tortured each son in front of her, one by one, until finally killing her. And not one of them denied her faith or ate it. Those stories kind of like, maybe we should not collaborate. And then it comes down to the man who kind of started the whole rebellion, and his name was Matthias. Okay? He was a priest in a little bitty town, and while he was there, he noticed the officials came to town, right, doing the same thing, forcing people to eat pork, make sacrifice, and you read in First Maccabees, his story, he's like, and just as he finished speaking, one of the men from Monin decided to obey the king's decree and stepped out in front of everyone to offer a pagan sacrifice on the altar that stood there. When Matthias saw him, he became angry enough to do what had to be done. Shaking with rage, he ran forward and killed the man right there on the altar. He also killed the royal official who was forcing the people to sacrifice. Then he tore down the altar. In this way, Matthias showed his deep devotion for the law, just as Phineas had done when he killed Zimri, son of Saul. So Matthias starts this small little revolt. Then he dies, and he has his sons, his 5 sons, 3 of them he charges, I'm dying, you boys make this, you keep the fight going. We can win. We can win. And so his first son is Judas Maccabees. That's where we get the term from the book Maccabees, and that's when we call this the Maccabean period. Now Judas Maccabees decides that he's going to keep this going, and he gets a pretty significant group together, and they start fighting the Syrians, or the Seleucids, right, to resist Hellenization, or becoming Greek. Now, the first thing he did, though, was he attacked the Acra, right, the little fortress by the temple. As a matter of fact, they couldn't stalemate. So the Seleucids say, if you back down and quit, we'll give you the temple. And we'll give you religious freedom. So Judas Maccabees, they don't get political freedom, but they get religious freedom. And the first thing he does is goes in, right? They have to cleanse the temple, right? Because of the pig sacrifice there. They remove the sacrifice, they remove Zeus. He rededicates the temple, and that's called Hanukkah. And that's what Hanukkah is about. Hanukkah is celebrating that Judas Maccabees won religious freedom and rededicated the temple. So that's the whole reason of Hanukkah being celebrated today. Because you notice it's one of the holidays that's not in the Bible, right? A lot of the holidays, Jewish holidays, we see. That one we don't see because it happened in that middle period. And he, while attacking the citadel again, 4 years later, he's killed. So his brother Jonathan comes to power. So Jonathan now comes to power, and he rules from 160 to 143. You know, 23 years. They're fighting the whole time. They have religious freedom, but Jonathan attacks the citadel. He fails also, but he gets a little more freedom. And this is really significant what Jonathan did. Very significant. He now combines the office of ruler and high priest. Have you ever noticed in the Old Testament, it's very distinct, isn't it? The king and the religious leaders are completely separate, right? Matter of fact, there's a lot. The king cannot go to the temple. Remember, Saul got in trouble, remember? When we were making a sacrifice. God was clear. King here, political leaders here, priests and Levites are here. We get to the New Testament and the high priest. Remember when Jesus is the political leader, the local government leader, and the religious leader. This is when it changed. Jonathan said, I'll be high priest and ruler. There were a group of Jews who were very, very unhappy with that. They're like, wait a minute, we weren't happy when Antiochus put a non-Zadokite line guy in priesthood. Now we're still not happy that because you're violating the Old Testament. So this small group got upset and they moved outside and live by themselves. Okay? Eventually they're called the Essenes. Okay? Now, what happened was, they had their own copies of the Bible. So when that little boy in 1948, there was some boy throwing rocks, remember? And he threw rocks in the cave and he heard something break, and they went in there and he found what? The Dead Sea Scrolls. It was this group's scrolls. When they left, they're like, we're not going to participate. If you're going to combine the office of priest and king and ruler, then we're leaving. And they left. And that's me chasing. Can I chase one around that? The Dead Sea Scrolls were significant because when they were discovered, they were 500 years older than any known copy of the Old Testament. And every single book of the Old Testament was completely found except the book of Esther. And Esther. They may have not liked it because, Esther is the only book in the Old Testament that God's name is not directly mentioned. Or someone checked that out. I don't know. It wasn't there. But every other book. So the big deal was, in secular world, literary world, that we're now going to see how the Bible was corrupt. Because it's all been, hand translated. Now we have copies 500 years older than anything known. And so they're like, now when they compare them, everybody's like, now we're going to be able to prove the Bible is just this human, and guess what? No differences. There were no differences between what was discovered in those caves and the other documents 500 years old. And that's why it was such a big deal. And that's why they fought over it for decades on who got the translation. You know that it was a battle. It wasn't until computers got snuck in that actually got out in the open. Anyway, I chased a rabbit. But anyway, that's what Jonathan did. He combined those two groups. And then there's another revolt, and Jonathan gets captured. They take him and put him in a dungeon, and then he's assassinated while he's in the prison. So, then the other brother, Simon, comes to power. The third one. Simon rules from 143 to 134. And he is the first to defeat the Acura, the city, the garrison there beside the temple. He takes it. And so all of a sudden, for the first time, the Jews have complete religious and political independence. Nobody's over them at all. So in 140, the Jews were so excited, they say, Simon and every descendant from now to the end of time, you're going to be king and rulers over the Jewish nation. Okay? You're going to be king of the... So, in 140, 150 years prior to the New Testament, with Jesus coming, they're already an independent nation again. And so Simon is there, and Simon was assassinated by his son-in-law. Okay, it gets a little tricky now, so stay with me. But by the way, you think this is wait till you come next week. Carrying stuff's so difficult, I have to give you a color-coded flow chart. I'm not kidding. It is just unbelievable. It's like, you marry who? I mean, it's just, yeah, it's just hard. But anyway, so now Simon is assassinated by his son-in-law, and then his son, John Hyrcanus, comes to power. John Hyrcanus begins what we call the Hasmonean dynasty of rulers. Okay? So when you hear the Hasmonean dynasty, that would be John Hyrcanus. Here's what's interesting. When he comes to power, kind of suspiciously, he does not punish the assassins of his father, and he imprisons his brothers and mother. Okay? He puts his brothers and mom in prison. He didn't want to have anybody else fighting over the throne. The Jewish state, we're back to the size now of pretty much David and Solomon's kingdom. That's where we are. We're back to pretty much as large as it's ever been. So this is full independence during this period of time. And then again, John Hyrcanus dies, and then Aristobulus comes to power, and being a good son, he immediately imprisons all his brothers and his mother as well. And then intentionally starves his mother to death. So he's a son of John. He's John's son. I didn't give you this, but I got a flow chart here. No, it's confusing. I have to keep a flow chart, seriously, of all this. I didn't want to burden you with it, but yeah. Aristobulus is John's, Hyrcanus' son. And then, let's see, he also killed one of his brothers, John, and then grieved himself to death over killing his own brother. He is the first to call himself king. Now, the others call themselves Jewish rulers. He's like, I'm king of the Jews. I'm like David. I'm a king. And then he dies. Aristobulus dies, and his brother, Alexander Janus, comes to power. Okay, now his brother comes to power. Here's what happens. Salome Alexandria, who was married to Aristobulus. When Aristobulus dies, Salome lets out all the other brothers from prison and marries the oldest one. Okay? So she lets all the brothers out, marries the oldest one, who is Alexander Janus. He was constantly at war his entire reign. He was over 25 years, and he died. And we were told that it was really the size of Solomon's kingdom when he died. You see why the Jews are upset about being subject to Rome? They're looking back to the glory days, not of David, just of a few decades ago. You know. And so when he dies, Salome decides, I think this time I'll just rule. So she doesn't marry any other brothers, she rules. And she has this group of leaders that she's really been working on. It's a group of local religious leaders that she's kind of poured into, and she uses them to kind of help her get her way. And they're called the Pharisees. And she's the first to put the Pharisees on the Sanhedrin, because she and the Pharisees get along really, 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 really well. She was actually one of the best, if not the best, of all the rulers. There wasn't a lot of fighting. She reigned pretty well. They were a pretty prosperous nation. Not really hardly any wars. And she died at 73. Unfortunately, she apparently wasn't a very good mother. Her two kids come to power. Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Okay. Hyrcanus was the younger one, and history books say, what's the word they use for him? Retiring. In other words, he didn't want to be king. He didn't care. He didn't want to be king. His younger brother had just about convinced him to sign over the kingship to him. So basically, Aristobulus had pretty well convinced Hyrcanus, let me be king. And Hyrcanus was like, I don't care. I don't want to be king anyway. And so it looked like it was going to be a pretty peaceful. The older was officially king. He was going to turn over. But next to, on the eastern side of the Jordan, is a kingdom called Idumea. It would be one of those half-breed Jewish from the Syrians, intermixed people. And there was a gentleman over there in the Idumea kingdom, one of their, not necessarily rulers, but powerful men, who decided that if he could convince Hyrcanus to fight for kingship, it would help the Idumean Empire, and he and his family would help them all. You understand what I'm saying? So he comes in and convinces Hyrcanus, you really do want to be king. Hyrcanus like, I don't want to be king. No, you want to be king. I don't want to be king. You really do want to be king. You need to fight your brother. Your brother's being unfair. Your brother's taking away from you. He's just working. So Hyrcanus finally says, you're right. I do want to be king. And then the two brothers started fighting. Hyrcanus got his army. Aristobulus got his army. And they start fighting each other there in Jerusalem over who's going to be the king. Okay? But yet, the problem is they're equal in strength and power and influence. So they're just at a constant stalemate. And then here's the decision they make. There's this nation called Rome. And there's a Roman general called Pompey. You know him? You should know him. Caesar, Pompey, and Brutus were the first Roman triumvirate. Right? Octavian, Brutus. Octavian was the political, Brutus was the money, and Pompey was the military power. Pompey was in Damascus, putting down that, conquering Damascus. And so the two brothers both sent messengers to the Roman general Pompey and said, hey, would you come down and act as mediator and pick which one of us should be king? And Pompey said, sure. So he comes to Jerusalem with the Roman legions. And when he gets there, and Aristobulus said, yeah, I don't like this idea. I'm going to fight against him. So Aristobulus gets his little army, and he goes against the Roman legion. Which this one did not go well. Matter of fact, he goes to the temple, and he barricades himself in the temple, thinking the temple is safe. Pompey goes to the temple. He goes through the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, the court of the men, captures Aristobulus, and keeps going all the way into the Holy of Holies. Rips the curtain back and says, what's in this room? That's how Rome introduced themselves to the Jews. See a little bit of the hostility? And Rome ended on that day Jewish independence. The size of Solomon's kingdom. Rome walked in through Pompey and said, you are no longer an independent nation. And he put Hyrcanus in power, and he took Aristobulus back to Rome and brought him out at parties and dinners. You know, as one of the conquered kings. Eventually, Pompey confirms Hyrcanus as high priest, but not king. You want to be high priest? I don't care. I'll give you a little bit, I'll give you a little area to rule here, but you're gone. And then he looks at Antipater and says, I appreciate your help here. Why don't you be governor? So now this Antipater who worked Hyrcanus over, he gets to be governor. Hyrcanus is the high priest. Antipater says, hey, I got a couple sons. Can you give them some power too? So Pompey says, sure. So Faisal, his son Faisal, becomes ruler of Judea, and his other son, Herod, becomes ruler of Galilee. And that's how Herod gets in, from his dad, from Idumea, going over and working the system. Okay? Kind of see how it's all starting to kind of put together here? Now, Caesar comes down, and he lands in Egypt, because you know the story, right? Brutus is killed, and then Caesar and Pompey start fighting over who's going to, you know, we can't have these three rulers, we've got to have one ruler. So Julius Caesar, right, or they start, and Pompey, they start fighting, and then Pompey escapes down to Egypt with the Ptolemies, and then Caesar comes down to fight him, and Pompey's assassinated. Julius Caesar gets blocked in by the Ptolemy army, and Antipater sends supplies and everything he could down to Julius Caesar. And so he defeats all the Ptolemaic armies. Leaves the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra, in power, because obviously they're having a thing anyway. Well, she was everybody, even Antony. So, Julius Caesar says, I like these Jews. Give them religious freedom. And I like Antipater, keep his sons in power. So Antipater, however, is poisoned. It's a family thing. In 42 BC, and Mark Antony steps in and appoints Herod and Faisal as joint rulers of the Jewish state. Okay? Joint rulers of the Jewish state. So the Hasmonean line just about gone. And I'll talk about last time, I'll talk about next time we go through Herod. Herod, trying to ingratiate himself with the Jews, you know, he really wants to be loved by them. So he marries the last Hasmonean princess alive, Mariamne, thinking, I now am part of the Hasmonean dynasty, because I married one of them. And that is, we'll talk about that. So, anyway, we have all that going on. And then Aristobulus has a son named Antiochus II. He says, my family, the Hasmonean dynasty, needs to retake Jerusalem. So he rises up, and he starts another revolt against Herod and Rome. Now, the reason Palestine was so important militarily to Rome is Over here on the eastern side is a large empire called the Parthians. Okay? The Parthians were pretty strong, and they were a major problem and threat to the Roman Empire on the east. And so what Antigonus, the last Hasmonean ruler, the son of the one who got taken off, right? What he does is, he goes to the Parthians and said, hey, you want to go beat up the Romans? And so the Parthians come over and they help him, and it works. He kicks out the Romans and Herod. And before Herod leaves, he had built a special bunker for his family called Masada. Okay? Now it comes into other place later. Herod puts his family in Masada, which is, you've seen it. It's basically a big pile with a little city on top. And then he takes off to Rome. He escapes to Rome. And he's in Rome. And while he's in Rome, he plays it up pretty good. He's really good at Roman politics. And the Romans love him. They absolutely love him. As a matter of fact, Octavian and the Senate in 40 BC unanimously vote Herod is officially the king of all Jews. Now, sidebar. When Antigonus comes to power, remember his father is Aristobulus, remember he was fighting with his brother, okay? He got taken to Rome. His brother is still alive as the high priest, okay, for Candace. He didn't want his uncle to be high priest. So he imprisons him, and then according to Josephus, he personally goes to the prison and bites off his ear. Here's why. The Old Testament says the high priest cannot have any physical defects. So in his mind, even if I get taken out, he can't be high priest again. I think you could have sent somebody to cut off his ear. But anyway, so that's the family, right? He bites off his ear because he just doesn't want that to happen at all. Antigonus is backed by all the Jewish classes. They hate Herod and they hate the Romans. But eventually, with the Roman legions, Herod retakes Palestine and Jerusalem. But it took him 3 years. It's called the Parthians. When he comes in, he eliminates a lot of the aristocracy of the Jewish aristocracy because they sided against him. He just eliminates them. Anyway, and then Mark Antony gives the order to execute Antigonus, which is the first king the Roman Empire had ever executed. They always just took him and kept him as trophies, bring them out for dinner, seriously, and parade them around every now and then. But he's the first one they ever executed. And then we'll talk later. But like I said, Antony, he had to step in between Cleopatra and Herod. They did not play nice. But anyway, any questions? I'm trying to answer.
I'm looking forward to the test.
That's the next question. The test is easy. It's easy. Now take it and read it. I hope it just sparks your imagination. There's so much. This is a thumbnail. I don't know why this is not a movie. I mean, it's such good material. Matter of fact, wait till you hear Herod's story. Like, this should be a soap opera. I mean, it's rich.
See, that's what I was thinking. This is that big one.
It's rich. Anyway, that's Clay Frank. God, thanks so much for loving us. And for obviously you working through history. We just thank you and praise you. Have any questions, let me know. Now you begin to see why they hated Rome so much, because they didn't want to go back to like David's days. They were thinking just decades earlier they were independent. And Rome ended it. And that's why they were afraid of Jesus, because he was going to mess it up and Rome was going to come in and take over all the power.